Hey friends, Elizabeth here, back again with another bullet journal video. And yes, I did, for the first time in many years of making monthly Plan With Me's, I did miss a month. I did not post an October Plan With Me last month, and it was weird for me too, okay? It felt really weird. There were reasons. I'm not going to get into it in this particular video. I will say that I am planning on making a video to properly talk about how I'm feeling about bullet journaling and bullet journal content right now, and sort of reflecting on my journey with it and plans for the future, and just, being open and vulnerable and sharing that with you. I'm not going to do that in this video because I think it deserves its own dedicated video, because bullet journaling has been part of my life for so long and part of my channel for so long, and there's just a lot to talk about there, but watch out for that. My hope is to have that video out to you within the next month or so. But right now, I want to talk about this painting that I painted for my November bullet journal, for my November cover page. I actually had the idea to do this theme in October, and because reasons in my life, I just couldn't manage it. It was not at all doable for me. So I delayed and decided to do it for November instead. You may have missed it, so I'll link it down below. But in October, I made a reading vlog where I reread the entire Anne of Green Gables series, all 8 books, which I have not read for a very long time. But the first book especially was an absolute favorite in childhood. I read it so many times. And it was a really special experience to reread the whole series and re-experience it as an adult and, have more hindsight and reflection looking back on the ways that I related to Anne as a child and why the story had such a big impact on me. Check it out if you are interested. But because I'd planned that video a couple months in advance, I knew I wanted to reread the series in October. I thought it would be fun to kind of theme my bullet journal around it as well and do a painting inspired by Anne of Green Gables. And what I really wanted to do was try to paint my vision of what Green Gables looks like, or a vision of what Green Gables looks like, and try to convey the beauty and the coziness and the sense of home that I have always felt reading about Green Gables from a young age. So when I wasn't able to do it in October, I was feeling pretty disappointed, but I wasn't quite ready to let go of this idea. It felt like something I still really wanted to do. So I decided to make this my November theme, and that is what this painting is. It's my attempt to portray Green Gables, and who knows how accurate it is. I feel like this house is probably not accurate at all to the style of the time. I did look up many pictures of Green Gables in various adaptations to try to get a sense of how other people have imagined it and try to get inspiration there. But it's not really so much about accuracy as it is about the feeling that you get reading about Anne of Green Gables, or more specifically, the feeling that I get reading about it. So as you can see, I'm starting by laying down some of the base colors, and even before that, I started by sketching out my plan. I actually started by drawing all of this out on my iPad in Procreate, so I could more easily change things and move things around. I could draw things in different layers and kind of move things and test things out. But once I had a plan I was happy with digitally and a nice composition, I sketched that plan onto my watercolor paper and started painting. I am using gouache for this, my Winsor & Newton gouache. I will link the colors I used in the description box down below, along with my other supplies, as always. But I decided to start by laying down some of those base background colors, so the color of the grass, the color of the path all the way to the house, and the very subtle light blue color of the sky, and then a base for the trees. So I have a mix of trees here, some regular brown trees of nondescript species. Maybe they're maples or something, I don't know. I am Canadian, but I don't live in PEI, so I can't say off the top of my head what species of trees are most common in PEI, but maple trees are pretty widespread in Canada, so let's say they're maples. And then I also wanted birch trees. I am weirdly obsessed with birch trees. They are my favorite tree. I don't know a lot about trees, but birch trees are my favorite, and part of that is that the house I grew up in had a big white birch tree in the front yard. It was huge and magnificent, and I thought it was one of the most beautiful things in the world. So it felt like if I was going to depict what Anne of Green Gables feels like to me, it would have to feel like home, and to feel like home, it would have to have at least one birch tree in the front yard. So birch trees were definitely a necessity, and for the birch trees, I did paint a base that is very hard to see because it is largely white, but it does have a very slight gray tinge, and then a slightly darker shade of gray to add a shadow to make them look a little bit more three-dimensional. I did also paint the walls of the house, the exterior that is going to be largely white, a base of the same very slightly tinted gray white. Then it was time to start adding some more detail and shadows to the trees. So I'm basically just progressively darkening this mix, and I'm basically just using the colors that I mixed initially, the light colors, and progressively darkening the mix so I can keep adding more layers of shadow and more detail, one layer at a time, slowly getting darker, but always keeping it within the same color family. Because I am just continuing to mix with those same colors, I am trying to keep things a little bit more cohesive and make it feel like all of these browns belong on the same tree, if that makes sense. I didn't really have a clear plan of the style going into this. I was considering going in a bit more of a cartoony direction initially, and that didn't necessarily fully pan out. I feel like in the end, the trees are a little bit more cartoonish looking than everything else, partially because of the way I did the shadows and the outlines. I don't really mind that personally. I don't really have a strong personal style when it comes to art and painting, because I have tried so many different styles and techniques over the years, and I just kind of try to use the style that works for whatever weird idea I have in my head. In this case, it was kind of a mix of things, but I ended up liking how it all worked together, even if it isn't all exactly the same style, so it is what it is. I was very inspired for the style of the trees by old paint by numbers paintings. I pinned well over 50 vintage paint by numbers landscapes when I was looking for inspiration, and the style of the trees in those old paint by numbers was very influential, I would say, in how I did the shading and the style of these trees. I also started adding some of those darker details on the birches, but then I realized that I would probably want to do this at a later date because I had so many more details to add in the background that might overlap some of these areas. So I started and then quickly put that on pause to come back to later, and instead moved to adding some details to the path or the dirt road that leads up to the house. I wanted this to look old and worn and also have sort of an indication of ruts in the road. I will continue to add more details to this, but this was just that first layer of detail, again using the same brown I initially mixed, but mixing in a little bit of Payne's gray to create a slightly darker and slightly desaturated version of that brown for the shadows. And then it was time to start on what I would say was the most time-consuming process of this whole painting, which was adding all of the leaves, all the foliage, all the greenery. Oh my goodness, this took forever. At first, I was going to add them in tiny little blobs, again, kind of in a similar style to paint by numbers, which I've done art inspired by paint by numbers in the past, but I quickly realized that was going to take an eternity. So instead, I started just creating much larger blobs, and I quickly realized that I was probably going to have a better time if I added leaves in much larger blobs, at least in the areas where I wanted the majority of a certain section of a tree or a bush to be one color, and then add highlights and details of other colors later. So starting with the same slightly yellowish green that I mixed for the grass. And once I had some good sections of that, I created a much more yellow version of that green and started adding that in big blobs and little blobs kind of all over. My intention was always for this to be a autumn scene. Of course, originally it was going to be October, but now it's November. Still, it is autumn, it is fall. We have all these gorgeous colors on the trees at this time of year. To be fair, by November in much of Canada, a lot of the leaves have fallen and we're starting to deal with snow. But I'm imagining this as very early November, where maybe in Avonlea they're able to hold on to that brilliant foliage just a little bit longer. I'm also using that much more yellow-green to start adding a bit more dimension to the grass. I want it to look like the grass is starting to yellow a little bit, but also like there have been leaves falling for a long time through this whole season, and they're sort of mixed in with the grass. So the grass has a lot more dimension and a lot more warm tones to it than the fresh verdant fields you would see in the spring or summer. I also wanted to add a lot of smaller shrubbery and foliage around the front of the house and around the sides. So I am adding that as well. Again, just using all the same colors of green, and it's all the same greens that I've mixed together that are kind of a range from a just slightly yellowish green all the way to yellow with the slightest tinge of green, to again get that sort of wide spectrum of greens. Of course, this is Green Gables, so the roof of this house, the gables of this house are going to be green. I wanted the house to stand out from the background, and so I used a pure color, this much more, at least in comparison, blue-toned green, more of an emerald, very deep and dark. It really is still a more warm-toned green in the grand scheme of things, but in comparison to how yellow the rest of the greens are in this painting, it definitely has more of that emerald blue tone to it, which I think adds a nice contrast and makes the house pop, even though it is sort of nestled in the background. I also decided to use the same green to add more dimension and some shadows and darker areas to the grass. So I am starting to do that here. My technique with the grass really evolved over the course of this painting. I just kept trying different things, and when I didn't really like something, I would just add a bit of water and kind of blend it out, or just add another color on top. That is usually my technique. I just try things, I throw things at the wall and see what sticks. And I definitely was doing that with the grass here. At this stage, it has a much more high contrast, cartoony look to it, and I do eventually soften that. But honestly, I kind of like both versions. They're just a very different style, a different way to depict grass, I suppose. I also decided to add some low lights, some shadows to the leaves by using this dark green in a couple target areas on the trees. And then I grabbed some just pure yellow. This is a nice deep mustard yellow, and I'm adding this throughout all the foliage. Again, I want this to look like the depths of autumn. So while I started with a very green palette, it is going to slowly shift throughout this entire painting into something that looks a lot more like all of the warm golden, red, orange tones of fall here in Canada. And again, just doing this a little layer at a time, a little bit at a time, adding a bit here, adding a bit there, and seeing how I feel about it. At this point, I took a bit of a break. I let everything dry, and I decided to add some more details to the house. So I'm just using my finest, teensy tiniest little brush and a little bit of Payne's Gray, and I'm trying to the best of my ability to add some details, some steps up to the porch, a railing all the way around this wraparound porch on the first level, some posts holding up the roof of the porch. I'm also starting to add in details of the windows. Of course, I added the green shutters earlier, but I'm going to start adding in the darkness of the windows. I'm also adding some light shadows under the edge of the roof line, which I will add to and expand upon later. I probably should have done those shadows before adding the other details. In retrospect, that would have been easier, but I didn't do that. I did it after, which was harder, but it is what it is. Again, when you're winging it, sometimes things are made more complicated than they need to be. One thing I really struggled with was the door. I could not decide how I wanted the door to look or be, and I changed it several times. So I started to kind of sketch it in, and then I wasn't sure about it, so I decided to leave it and move on to adding more color. I mixed a nice rusty orangey red and used that on the chimneys, which are meant to be brick, and then started adding a lot more orange through all the trees and the bushes. I also used some of the brown that I mixed for the trunks of the maple trees to add some brown to the foliage as well, just to kind of soften the saturation a little bit. Some of that orange I was using was very, very bright, and while leaves can certainly be that color, it was starting to feel a little bit too much, a little too saturated. I wanted to bring it back a little bit more to reality with some more brown leaves. At this point, I felt like I'd added enough in the background to allow me the opportunity to add some details to the birch trees. So I'm using that same really fine brush I used for details on the house to add this dark gray outline and some of these little details up and down the bark where that white bark is kind of pulled away. This is what really makes a birch tree look like a birch tree to me, all these little sort of dings and lines and marks. And again, there's just something so nostalgic and something that I love so much about birch trees, and this was very satisfying to me to paint. I also mixed this sort of greenish, grayish color to add shadows of the trees. So shadows all sort of moving from the left to the right. The idea is the light source is coming from the left, so that's where the lightest areas of the trees are. And the shadows of the trees are kind of crossing the roadway, and then the birch trees on the right, the shadows are kind of going off to the right. I also felt like the lower right-hand side looked a little empty, so I ended up adding some bushes here, some just tiny little stems for the bushes, and then adding leaves using all those same warm colors from yellow to orange to brown and a tiny bit of green. This stage was really just continuing to add more color, continuing to add more yellow in a lot of places. I felt like I needed more yellow to brighten things up in a lot of these spots, but really just hours and hours of picking up more yellow and plopping it down wherever I felt it needed it. This was also the point where I felt like the grass was pulling too much attention. My eye was drawn to it because it was so high contrast. So I ended up using a damp brush to kind of blend the colors a bit more, make it a little bit more murky and mixed and subtle, so that the eye would hopefully be drawn a little higher up on the painting to the trees and the house, which are the focal point. I also used my teeny tiny brush in some white gouache to add some smaller panes on the windows and some other small details on the house, and just kept adding more and more yellow. So much more yellow everywhere. At this point, I felt like I had to stop. I honestly probably could have kept adding little blobs of paint for days and days and still felt like I could add more. But at some point it felt like it had to be over, and this was the point I chose. So I left it to dry overnight, and in the morning I pulled off the washi tape to reveal my final painting of Green Gables. Is it the most perfect painting to ever exist? No. Do I really like it? Yes, I do. It feels very nostalgic and cozy and homey, and it makes me happy to look at it, which was really my goal. So I feel like I can check that box. Goal accomplished. I wanted to keep the original painting so I could maybe display it somewhere or give it as a gift to someone someday. So I scanned it and tried my best to color match, but my printer hates me, so I literally spent, I think, 5 hours adjusting colors in Photoshop and Lightroom, trying to get a printed version that had the same colors as my original painting, and it was not happening because my printer is the worst. So I eventually gave up. This was the closest I could get. I was starting to feel very frustrated. I truly don't think I could have gotten it closer unless I just bought a new printer, which is not in the cards right now. So this was the best version I could get. I cut it out, glued it in, and then I wanted to add a header along the bottom, and I thought I would kind of combine the traditional header for a bullet journal for the month with a little bit of a description of the painting. So I wrote November at Green Gables along the bottom, and I had initially used a slightly finer nib pen to do it, but it felt a little too light. It didn't have the punchiness I wanted, so I ended up going back over it with a thicker pen for a little bit of a bolder line. And then it was time for all of the, little details it takes to finish a bullet journal setup, creating my monthly calendar, which is very simple and straightforward, cutting out the tabs that I always cut out, decorating them. This time I decided to decorate them with washi tape, which was fun. A little bit of a neutral gingham, which felt like the kind of fabric Marilla would have used to make a dress for Anne that Anne would have complained about because it wasn't girly and frilly and puffed sleeved enough. And then to create my weeklies, which are also pretty straightforward and simple, just using my Secura microns, not adding any more art or color or pattern, just letting the painting on the cover page be the art here. And again, the little bit of a fun pop of pattern with the gingham washi tape on the tabs. And that is how this setup turned out. I really like it. I'm very happy with how this painting ended up coming together. Like I said, it feels very nostalgic and cozy and homey and comforting, and I appreciate that. I'm thanking myself for doing it. I think it was a very fun experience, even though there were definitely moments where I just wondered what I was doing and if it was going to turn out and how many more hours I was going to spend stippling tiny little leaves before I could be done. But in the end, I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I decided to still do the theme, even though I couldn't get it done in October as originally planned. And I hope you enjoyed watching the process. With that, I am going to end this video. Thank you for watching. Check out my Anne of Green Gables reading vlog if you haven't seen it. I had a lot of fun making it. And with that, I'm gonna get going. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.